The sandwich is one of the biggest food innovations in the last 300 years. It seems so incredibly simple. A little bit of bread on the top and the bottom and something in the middle like a wonderful slice of meat, and everything is different. This invention changed everything. There are over 300 million people in America today. How many sandwiches do you think were eaten last year? The number has to be incredible. And what even is a sandwich? The legal definition of a sandwich is different, varying from state to state. Is a taco a sandwich? Is a hot dog a sandwich? If we go back to 250 years ago, it's much simpler. But let's push back even farther. Back into the late Middle Ages, when people were eating on trenchers, they were loaves of bread specifically made to be a plate that you would eat your food upon. And you might not even eat the plate itself, but you could, or you might give it away to a poor person. It's getting close to the idea of a sandwich, but we don't have a top yet, and it's huge. Another example is sippets and sops. Pieces of bread that they would use within their meals. They would put their food upon these little slices of bread, or maybe put them in their soups. Again, to help them eat their food, but it just didn't make it so that you could pick it up in your hand. It's hard to believe that the idea of the sandwich doesn't pop up until 1760 with John Montagu, the Earl of Sandwich. And apparently he's a heavy gambler or someone who plays lots of games. He wants to be able to snack, he wants to be able to eat food and not get his fingers dirty and not have to use a fork. So he asks his valet to bring him a slice of salted beef with 2 slices of bread on either side, and voila, we have the sandwich. Now, this idea seems to take off pretty quickly in one sense, but very slowly in another sense. We see Gibbon, an author in the late 18th century, and he writes in his journal in 1762 about eating in a gentleman's club, and multiple people are eating a sandwich, as he calls it. Now, these sandwiches at the time were very small little sandwiches and very simple, with just bread and a slice of meat, maybe something like butter, possibly a piece of cheese, and that's it. They show up in a cookbook in 1777 in The Lady's Assistant with Charlotte Mason, and she gives us a very simple, small recipe for sandwiches. Also in the late 18th century, we start to see the concept of sandwich show up in literature. We have novels and the occasional novel where they talk about eating sandwiches. But again, the way it's kind of inferred or talked about, sandwiches are a very light little thing. They're just small little snacks. That's really all they are. But the sandwich does start to really come into its own in the 19th century. We've got a cookbook in the early 19th century, about 1827, and there are 5 or 6 recipes for sandwiches. Cheese sandwiches and a shrimp sandwich and egg sandwiches. And then by the middle or late 19th century, we have a restaurant in 1866, and that restaurant has as many as 100 different sandwich recipes. Here is Gibbon giving a description of a gentleman's club, and it's November 24th, 1762. A sight truly English, 20 or 30 perhaps of the first men in the kingdom, in a point of fashion and fortune, supping at little tables covered with a napkin, and in the middle of a coffee room, upon a bit of cold meat, or a sandwich, or drinking a glass of punch. It's interesting that these early sandwiches seem to be something that we might call a snack. And that term itself is very interesting. In the 18th century, a snack, by a general definition, meant something that was shared or your part in something else. And sometimes later on it became the meaning of a small bite of something. And you can see how those two things go together. Like you would have a large bowl of snacks and everyone would have one part in that. But let's make that very first sandwich. Charlotte Mason's The Lady's Assistant has the first recipe for sandwiches. It goes like this. Sandwiches. Put some very thin slices of beef between thin slices of bread and butter. Cut the ends off neatly. Lay them in a dish. Veal and ham cut thin may be served in the same manner. So very, very simple. It's just the bread, a little butter, a little meat. It's interesting that most of these early sandwich recipes do not get very complex. They don't have lettuce, they don't have tomato or sauces necessarily. Sometimes they talk about a little bit of mustard, but butter seems to be a common implement here. This could not be simpler. Now we're going to take a nice loaf of white bread here and slice it into thin slices. Now remember, we're gonna cut off all the crust and that later on, but first we're gonna cut this into nice thin slices, and I'm going to butter this bread lightly. Now some of these recipes we might have toasted this bread, but again, it's meant to be picked up with your fingers. You don't want to get them greasy, so we're going to have just butter on one side. We're also going to cut our beef in very thin slices. Now, these first recipes where the Earl of Sandwich, he was making sandwich with salt beef, which may or may not have been cooked. But we just have a nicely cooked piece of beef here. It's cold, it's already a little dry, which is perfect for our sandwich in this circumstance. Let's make one of the sandwiches out of the 1827 cookbook. This one's the ham and cheese. Prepare a gallimaufry of cheese with equal parts butter and season agreeable to taste. Spread it upon bread. Cover it with thin slices of ham, tongue, breaded beef, or bacon. Cover it with another slice of bread. Press it together. Cut it into small pieces. Serve all sandwiches upon a napkin. Now, this one's going to be equally easy. We'll have to prepare our gallimaufry. So we'll take equal parts of cheese and butter. I'm going to heat this in our frying pan and turn it into a nice sauce that we can spread upon our slices of bread. Then goes on the ham. We'll press it together. That will be our sandwich. I like this idea of the ham and cheese sandwich, and the cheese is soft. They want to make this easy to eat. So it's a gallimaufry. That's just a hodgepodge, a mixture of our cheese and butter. I love digging into the food because we get something like this. A food that was a very rich man's food. The Earl of Sandwich, and he invents this, and then it's in gentlemen's clubs. And 100 years later, it becomes a workman's food, a common food for everyone. And then today, it's a fast food. Everyone's eating it, and it's the cheapest thing you can buy. I really love the look of these. You can see how they're so fancy. You know, I'm not an expert on sandwiches today, but I would love to hear in the comment section about your craziest sandwich that you've ever eaten. Earlier, I asked the question about were tacos a sandwich or were hot dogs a sandwich? And that leads me back to hot dogs for just a second. Hot dogs are a really interesting story. They're just a little sausage and they're in a bread bun. The same reason why we have bread on these sandwiches, to keep our fingers clean. In 1870 or so, someone wanted to sell little sausages. But they were walking in Coney Island and they didn't want to get their fingers dirty. And so he had to invent the hot dog bun. And that's 110 years after the sandwich. Let's try a couple of these 19th and 18th century sandwiches. Let's start at the beginning with the famous Earl of Sandwich sandwich. Here it is, our beef, a little bit of butter, a little bit of bread. I could be playing cards right now. My fingers are still clean, maybe working at my desk, just like John Montagu. The butter brings in just enough moisture, even though the meat is kind of dry, which is exactly what they would have had on those early sandwiches. Now, here's the ham and cheese with the gallimaufry of cheese. I want to try that one out. This one looks really good, and I really like the look on this one. Ham and cheese, one of my favorites. I love it. That cheesy mixture with butter and cheese makes a wonderful soft cheese sauce that goes on there, and it tastes fantastic.